Welcome to Sigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Sigest. My name's Rebecca Bloomer. I'm joining you from our Lincoln campus today, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome along to talk about his barley yoghurt project, Gert-Jan Moggre. Welcome, Gert.
Oh, thank you.
I am super excited to talk about this work. Sounds like a super interesting project, but for a couple of reasons for me specifically. One, that I've recently given up eating dairy myself, so I'm super excited to hear that there are some alternatives. Another thing that I really like about it, though, is just how kind of interdisciplinary it is. It's a really nice example of plant and food work across different portfolios, so hopefully we can chat a little bit about that as well. Mm-hmm. Before we get into it too much, though, would you mind taking a minute just to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do at Plant and Food generally?
Yep, sure. So I joined Plant and Food probably close to 8 years ago. Before that, I was doing a PhD in chemistry and biochemistry, where I looked at linking structure and function of biomolecules. And that I've taken to the work I do at Plant and Food. I'm part of the food chemistry and functionality team, where my work is focused on plant-based foods. Particularly relevant to today's conversation is the efforts in using fermentation to bring about positive changes, so to create texture, flavors, and ways of improving foods, and an area that I actively work in.
Cool. So today what we're going to talk about is a project that you initiated looking at using plant and food barley, so a plant and food variety, I believe.
That's correct.
As a base for creating a barley-based yogurt.
Yes.
So what is the kind of need that you see there that you think the project can help meet?
So if we look at the plant-based foods on the market, a lot of people will be familiar with the plant-based milks, and that they've seen a significant growth. If you look at the availability and the quality of these products, have significantly increased. They're better accepted by consumers and now take up a large part of the product aisle if you go and look for these products. If we then look at what other products that might fit this same area, or the yogurts and fermented dairy alternatives immediately spring to mind. So these products are available, but probably are not yet meeting consumer needs. So while there's been activities to get these, first generation products out, and they are consumed, but they're definitely not of the same magnitude or size in terms of sales.
There's certainly not the diversity either, is there, with the yogurts?
Yeah, and with that, I believe it partly comes from the texture and flavor that these products have. They just don't meet a more mainstream consumer might be looking for. So clearly the products fill a niche, so where there's dietary restrictions or other decisions that people make, like yourself, you were saying you avoid dairy for personal reasons, then you might look for these products. But ideally, or longer term, where we want these products to be, is that you'd go for these, but not just for those reasons, also that they provide the texture and flavor that consumers are looking for.
Yeah, I will say I have found plenty of good options among the coconut yogurts, but I happen to like coconut. So if you're someone who doesn't or has an allergy there, I don't know if there are any alternatives.
I mean, so coconut is an interesting one, and it really highlights that as long as you've got the flavor and texture, people will buy it. It shows that while nutrition is important, if you don't get the repeat purchase without meeting those needs. I mean, soy might not be as popular, but soy products, there are some good soy products out there, but people obviously people are avoiding some of those for reasons associated with it being made of soy. Yeah, and beyond that, I think the products might just not quite have that same quality again.
Yeah, sure. So with bringing in barley as an option, why did you pick barley specifically of the potential things you could try fermenting?
So I came to the barley work a bit later. This was started as a collaborative project between Andy and the Food Solutions team, where we had an existing cultivar that's high in beta-glucan. Beta-glucan is a fibre that has associated health benefits to heart health, specifically, so as long as you use the whole grain, you can make a health claim. And my team had done work previously for different uses for these beta-glucans, and having that valuable germplasm sitting there was a question of, can we do a collaborative project where we look at not just getting the right properties, and barley has some benefits that make it a good crop to consider, but also if we then link that with processing so that we get the best barley breeding lines that have the nutritional components but also the processing properties into a food. And for this a barley milk was chosen, and so there's some really nice work was done as part of that collaboration. Then talking to Irene and her team, we put the idea forward of, well, what does a fermented product look like, sort of as a next step. And if we bring that in now, we could potentially do some piggybacking. We can grow that potential of products that we might make. So we wanted to take advantage of some of the work that had already been done and use that. I guess it gives us control over the process, and with that we can then look at ways of improving the fermentation specifically. So while the work itself is not directly tied to barley, we see that this could be applied to a range of other, particularly grains, but even just wider plant materials or sources. The first off the block would be the barley, just because that's what we've used.
Sure. So just adding a wee bit of context for our listeners who won't be familiar with the teams you've mentioned. Andy's our barley breeder.
Yes.
And Irene, I confess I don't know who Irene is.
So Irene works in the food solutions team. That's a part of my wider group, who do a lot of commercial work and product development type projects. And yeah.
So this is really starting with the barley breeders and germplasm, looking into what might be unique about some of our plant and food stuff and how that might be useful for the food innovation folks to get the best out of them. Is that fair?
Yeah, and also linking technologies. So we've got a whole package. So, I mean, it's important to mention the advantage of having the ability to control your feed material to get the best product out. And we do this successfully for bread, for example, where we select them and try and improve on the baking qualities, and those are monitors throughout that process. In a similar way, we're trying to take advantage of linking those two for barley and the dairy alternatives that we've been working on.
So you mentioned earlier fermentation being a really key part of this whole process, and I think that's the part that you're particularly passionate about.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about, presumably it's quite different starting with a plant-based milk as opposed to a dairy one. What are some of the things that you've needed to consider to get those processes to work for plants? Yeah,
so if we think about dairy milk versus a plant-based, there's going to be other components present, and how the food develops is a bit different. So in dairy, we heavily rely on lactose that's fermented. It's the main carbohydrate. The proteins are also quite different from what we find in plants. And obviously, the milk and dairy milk has a particular flavor profile that we're familiar with. When we move to a plant-based material, the base inherently is different. It contains other components which can be beneficial, which is worth bearing in mind, that we have to work with. So you've got a wider range of carbohydrates, you've got fibers to contend with, and the proteins might be a bit different. So the base, if we consider those two, it also changes what we need. The organisms that do the fermentation, they have different requirements. We need them to do different things. So we want to make... Yeah.
Absolutely not a case of taking whatever bacterial culture you would throw at a dairy-based product and hoping it works. There's a whole lot of other things to think about, clearly.
And also ways of enhancing, I guess, as I said at the start, these products are not meeting consumer needs. And this is a biological process we can design to give us more of what the consumers are looking for, so that we get the texture and flavor that people want and can build on that.
So to what extent, thinking about flavor, is that coming from the plant-based milk, and so dependent on what kind of plant you're choosing for the process versus flavour coming from the bacteria involved in the fermentation process?
They go hand in hand. The base definitely provides a base flavour, and that will carry through into the final product. So these products do taste a bit different. And in some cases, that's a positive, right? You mentioned the coconut yogurts, where the coconut flavour is a feature. And I think in the same way, we can look at some of the plant bases. So a good example is the oat-based products, which have seen a lot of success. It's quite well accepted, and it's partly due to the flavour being a familiar one to consumers. Then in terms of the fermentation, providing in a yogurt, which is a fresh ferment, there's some key flavours that will help make you think of it as a yogurt when you open it. And it's particular brands, now having worked with these ourselves, we can really tell when you open the packet, you're like, oh yeah, those are coming from using particular bacteria, and you get these lovely fresh fermented flavors as you first start using the product. That's before you eat it, so that helps with that experience. And then when you consume it, it'll meet that expectation. And we want to achieve the same in our plant-based yogurts that we're working on.
So this project, can you tell us a little bit about what kind of the research aims are then specifically? Are you particularly looking for different bacteria, different fermentation techniques? What's really going to be key to making it work?
So we've looked at ways that we can gain control over the outcome. So when we make these products commercially, you use starters, which are effectively live bacteria that you add, and then you ferment your product. In dairy, you would add it to a milk, and it would acidify it, and then you end up with a nice product at the end. So in a way, we want to make sure that any starts we work with can still do the same. We still need that fermentation to drive the acidity. Then the texture is partly responsible in dairy products from the proteins that are present, but not all plant-based dairy alternatives have that. And so the texture is built a bit differently. You need to use other ingredients as well as the fermentation. So we are looking for strains that might help build that texture a bit more. So they might release certain functional ingredients that we can rely on. And in terms of flavor, again, it's then looking for organisms that produce the ones that are of interest. The project itself then looks for ways that we can control. We don't just want we want to know what we're doing, I guess. We want to have control over the process. So we deliver the right amount of those flavors and those that are desirable.
So as someone who is familiar with plants but not remotely with bacteria, how do you even know where to start looking for something that'll be suitable to do the job?
Fermentation has been carried out and used for humans for thousands and thousands of years. There's a good amount of research out there in dairy, but also in plants. So we know certain classes or certain groups, of lactic acid bacteria being the obvious one, are really important for these types of foods. And there's a wide range of bacteria that belong to that group of lactic acid bacteria, which we can then look at. Each bacterium can be a little bit different. So we want to find those that give us the enhancements that we're looking for. And there's some of this is based on what we know from literature and other observations you make, and some of it is just you smell it or you analyze and look for compounds and just whether it is pleasant, because that's what we've done previously, right? We would have tried to ferment something, and if it doesn't smell very nice, we probably wouldn't eat it. So we obviously try and understand specifically what happens, but those observations are part of that discovery process sometimes.
That does lead quite nicely into another kind of aspect of this that I wanted to touch on a little bit, which is this project is collaborative with the breeders, but in addition to that, you're working really closely with folks within Plant and Food in another portfolio, our bioprotection portfolio, who are experts on the microbiology side of this work. And what is it that they're doing that's really key to the project?
Yeah, you're right, and this is an ongoing collaboration where we rely on their microbial skills to help manage those cultures, and as well as for us to give visibility what's happening during the fermentation of that process. We are more, so my team and the people I work with within that are focused on the chemistry side and understanding what happens at the molecular level, but that can only take us so far. Like you mentioned, those bacteria and the culture that we work with are essential to giving us the outcome. And so Simon Bullman's team and Sandy Keenan specifically have done a lot of work in this with us to help us both isolate lactic acid bacteria that we might want to take advantage of, as well as to monitor and keep track of the fermentations that we carry out.
Of the different steps that you've mentioned, or aspects of getting a really good consumer acceptable product, you've talked a bit about flavour and a bit about texture. What's been the most challenging to get right?
It's an interesting question, that. So when we set out, we had identified two particular targets, one that was for texture and one for flavour. And my expectation was that the texture would be more challenging in a way. But it turned out to be the flavour. So flavour is quite delicate and changes. So finding ways to do that consistently proved to be a lot more challenging than we had initially considered. Having said that, while we can change the texture, we're not at a point where we've consumed these products, because we can't. This is still a work in progress. And the real test will be what happens when we get to use what we've developed to date and try it, because then I might have to answer that question differently.
I might have to ask you again in a few months' time.
Yeah.
So at the moment you're kind of going on observation, so things like smell and what you can infer about texture, presumably by, I'm going to say poking it, which is not a very sciencey word, but if you can't actually try kind of mouthfeel, then presumably it's what happens if I stick a spoon in it. And
yeah, we've got techniques that allow us to do that a bit more, I guess, in a controlled or systematic way. And the thickness is a key indicator. So we use rheology. We've got a thing called a rheometer, which allows us to measure the viscosity, and that's a measure. While there's more factors that influence mouthfeel, it is a good first indicator that we're changing the way that this material is behaving. So it's a way that can measure the mechanical properties and which are related to texture. So this first piece was really around showing that we could achieve changes there. The next question will be, how much is leading to a more desirable product? And the same for the volatiles. We have HPLC. So this is we can then analyze for specific metabolites, specific compounds that we know are positively associated with yogurts. I'm going to insert here, the thing worth mentioning is also that fermentation is a biological process, so clean label is a part of the wider thinking behind this project, and it might be worth bringing that back in. So fermentation itself is beneficial, because it's a label-friendly way. Yeah.
So can you tell me what you mean by clean label?
If we look at the products that are on the market that do exist, so particularly, in yogurts to an extent, but if we go to other dairy products, there's a lot of functional ingredients that are needed to give the texture and flavor that we're looking for. So in response, or what we see is that consumers increasingly prefer what is called a clean label, or a product where the minimum amount of process aids are used, so the E numbers that people might try and avoid. And so that sets behind all of the work that's been done. So both the milk and the yogurt have taken that into consideration. For yogurt specifically, because like we've discussed, the fermentation can bring positive change, we can build on that, and fermentation is perceived as a more natural way of achieving that. So like the functional ingredients that might come from an organism that is produced as part of the fermentation process, you end up with a product that has less ingredients, better meets that consumer need. And in some ways might be that second generation product that we hope to achieve.
Coming back to your point about texture and viscosity and things, are you aiming for a yogurt that is more like, this is going to make me sound like a terrible parent, like the, kind of the Rip Top, I probably shouldn't mention brand names, but, you get a 6-pack of yogurt that's the sort of slightly more processed kind of what's the word I'm looking for here? Like I guess my personal preference is for kind of a thicker Greek style yogurt as opposed to
Drinking yogurt.
A drinking yogurt, certainly. And then there's something in the middle that's almost a little bit, or maybe it's maybe it's not in the middle, maybe it's at the far end, but it's like the really thick, almost you'd invert the pot and it comes out in one thing. So what are you aiming for with the barley one in terms of a happy level of viscosity, in your opinion?
We're trying to develop the fermentation technology that we can create the range, so that when we work with clients that want to commercialize a product, that they can tailor that thickness to the product category that they are aiming for. So the work that we've done allowed us to understand better what is the outcome and how we can control the viscosity at the end. So whether we get a drinking yogurt or, like you say, spoonable or something that's even thicker than that. Ideally, we see that we can provide in all of those, and the work we've done is really to try and understand what levers we can pull in terms of the fermentation process that will give us those properties. So it's really, we're targeting the range. But for this particular product, we have focused on the spoonable products, which sits nicely in the middle. Some of them have definitely not been as thick. So we know that we can at least do that end, and processing that we've developing alongside the fermentation work also has given us a handle if we want to go to the more thicker products. So
you really should be able to span the range in the end. Sounds really cool. You've mentioned flavour, you've mentioned texture as really important to consumers. What about kind of nutritional content?
Yeah, nutrition is a really good question, I think. So I briefly touched on it at the start. When we move to plants, what you can provide is a bit different. So plants have fibres which are healthy for us to consume. So the beta-glucan being the one that we make shine in the barley, but generally fibre consumption is low in a Western diet, so bringing fibre across is a positive thing to do. These products sometimes are criticised for is the protein content. In some cases, this is below what you might see in a dairy product and what consumers might be looking for. So we haven't specifically focused on getting a high protein content. We focused on the clean label and bringing across that heart health fibre claim, but nothing stopping us from adding protein to this. It will change some of what we might get. Proteins, if you ferment them, contribute to the thickness, to the texture that we talked about. There's nothing there that we can't work with. So I believe that as products get better, they'll be able to better meet the nutritional needs that these products can provide.
A selfish question, as to be fair, a lot of mine are from my kind of personal research interest. To what extent do you think that these are things that our breeders could be targeting within the plant breeding program? So at that end of the spectrum, are there things you could be feeding back to our cereals team in terms of their phenotyping and in terms of the targets they might have for developing new varieties? Or is it really something that needs to be handled in the fermentation process or in the processing end?
I think we should take advantage of every step. So I think this was a really good example where the efforts in breeding gave a advanced line that had a significantly higher beta-glucan content. That really helps. Then the processing to make sure it's retained. That's in this case was for the fibers, but in a similar way, if the protein, which we touched on, we might be able to breed for a high protein content, but there's a limit. But then we can consider what processing we could do to bring up that protein content, or maybe you'd have to blend. Some crops have higher protein content than others. I mean, barley is a limit, but legumes can be significantly higher. And then in the fermentation, the main change would be more around the digestibility and availability of those. But the change to the proteins would be more in the way that they texture, and I don't see fermentation itself at this stage of significantly boosting the protein content, for example.
Sure. It is, I think, a really nice example of what has always felt to me like kind of plant and food superpower, though, is that we have that whole process in-house in a way, right? Like we have the germplasm collections for plants and actually for bacteria in a funny kind of way. We've got people within our organization and we're able to be undertaking a lot of that work ourselves kind of in a really connected way, which is so cool and quite unique. And we have breeding programs, as you say. We've got different cereals, we've got legumes, we've got probably a few other options as well. Something that plant milks at least occasionally get criticized for is their perceived environmental impact. What might barley bring to the table in terms of plant milks or plant yogurts that's different?
The agronomics of the barley, I'm less familiar with this, so I'll try and get this this right. But my understanding is that they are more drought resistant and have a shorter growing periods. So there are traits that the barley can bring that make it fit within a growing cycle, and some of the traits naturally benefit in response to climate change. So there's more than just the grain that we can rely on, and why barley was a good crop to consider here.
Something that you mentioned, I think, when we were discussing before we started recording, is that you're using the whole of the grain as well.
Yes.
So it's a kind of a lower waste product.
Yeah, so if we look at the side streams coming from existing processes, there's still the fibres that I talked about. People don't like eating them as much. They can give a gritty texture to foods. These are often removed. And so a key part was to develop a process that allowed us to take all of the barley. This is also needed to be able to make that health claim. So it is only approved for a whole grain, so where all of the grain is taken across.
What actually, this is such an ignorant question of me, but what actually is the health claim associated with the high beta-glucan content?
It's a heart health, so it's positive. The same as for oats, so it's the same barley.
Right.
Health claim, they're the same class.
This is fascinating stuff. So how close are you to something that can actually be tasted, do you think?
It's the very next step for us. We want to bring the two aspects together in a product that we can consume, because it's essential to test. I mean, some of this we can already because we're relying on commercial strains, but particularly for some of those strains or bacteria that we found as part of our own collection, we'll need a little bit more. But I guess that's been another fun part of this project, is it has actually allowed us to take this a lot closer to that than any previous work we've been able to do.
So moment of truth is not too far off, though.
Funding, eh?
Isn't that always the answer?
Yeah.
Who gets to try it first? Or who has to try it
I
first? Who are you going to make
will be one of the
guinea pig?
researchers that feels, I think it will be us once we've met the safety profile that is required. And our products, we know that we can make them safe in that we achieve a parameters of the pH is where we need it to be, and we get the amount of bacterial growth that we expect, and that being the ones that we want is all there. It's like we've got confidence in what we've done. It's just that obviously want to make sure that it's produced in a way that meets that food safety, and the food safety team is worth acknowledging here. They've always been really good to help progress any questions and work that we've done here.
Maybe the food safety team should be the first ones to try it.
I don't know if I want them to. I would like to do it myself, actually. We've worked on this for quite a while. And
yeah, you must be excited.
Yeah, it's been really cool to see it develop, actually. And it's been a lot of fun as well. It's been really cool to work with a range of people in the way that we've been able to, and see the interest that it brings. I mean, we've spoken about this in a number of platforms, and it always brings questions. And like if you present posters or other scientific presentations, people are always interested in the finer details. I think there's still a good amount to come for fermentation generally.
Well, if you're looking for a volunteer after you're sure it's safe, I am always keen for a good non-dairy alternative, so happy to give it a try.
Excellent. We'll put you on the list.
I look forward to hearing when it's ready. Thank you so much for your time today, Gert. It sounds like a fascinating project, and I really do look forward to hearing when you're ready to put something out into the world for the rest of us to try.
Yeah, and thank you for a lovely conversation. That was
It's always interesting. I love Sigest because I just love talking to people I otherwise wouldn't necessarily get a chance to. I learn so much. And people are always excited to talk about their science. It's cool. And thank you as well to you, our audience. Please do remember to rate our podcast if you get a chance. Feel free to subscribe. You can find us across all of your kind of usual podcast platforms. Looking forward to talking to you, whoever our next guest is, on another episode of Sigest. And in the meantime, mā te wā.